Welcome to Courier Conversations. I am Jeff Robinson, your host. I am president and editor-in-chief of the Baptist Courier and Courier Publishing. And with me today is my co-host, my sometimes co-host, and we are glad to have you back, the perfect man for what we're going to discuss today, retired professor of philosophy and theology and preaching and evangelism, about everything else at North Greenville University, Dr. Walter Johnson. It's good to have you back with us today, Dr. J, to talk about really two questions, and they're in the news. So this is very, it's always current, but it's extremely current right now. And that is, does being conservative make a person a Christian? And can a liberal, and by this we mean a theological liberal, which usually comes with political liberalism, can that person make a claim to be a Christian? And so you have taught philosophy and theology of all kinds, because you always have to compare it against the truth over against the falsehood for decades. So welcome back to the show, and this is a very current topic always, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity of being back. I have a good time every time.
Well, he writes a monthly column of what the Bible says about, you name it, for the Baptist Courier. We're thrilled to have scooped him up after I told him I wasn't going to let him retire. There's just too much there, and we're not going to let it go to waste. And so today in particular, this has risen in the news because of an election in Texas, where James Talarico has emerged as the Democrat candidate for the Senate seat there in Texas. He is going up against one. There's been a runoff on the Republican side against one of two conservatives there. But what makes James Talarico so interesting is he is the secular media always identifies him as a seminary student. And he is a seminary student, and he has beliefs, and he claims to be bringing his Christianity into the public square. And a columnist, David French, many of our listeners will know that name, a New York Times columnist, wrote a column about him last week, in which David, who considers himself a conservative evangelical, not much unlike us, again, how he considers himself, we'll just say he's very friendly, considers him a Christian, a nice guy. And so this plays right into puts a practical face and a current face on the two questions we're wanting to answer today. So this is an ongoing thing. So for the first thing, being conservative, you're conservative, I'm conservative, but what does that have to do with orthodox, historic evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, obviously, Christianity has a history, as does every other religion. And simply because a person claims to be a Christian doesn't mean that they are. We live in sort of a society where, you get to identify as whatever you want. And if that's what you say you are, then who can say you aren't? And I would say, well, history says whether you are or are you not. And there is a meaning to what being a Christian is. And that certainly involves, at the very core, doctrinal elements, doctrinal statements, confessions, creed, beliefs. And if a person steps outside of those beliefs, I don't think there's a right to call themselves a Christian. Now, again, they can say they identify with that, but they're not going to be Christian in any traditional sense of the word. And if you'll notice, I started to say if you notice carefully, sometimes you don't have to notice carefully, it's glaring, that the way they interpret the doctrines of the faith are completely different than what has been in line with traditional Christianity. And in many, many cases on these core doctrines, it would be places where even Roman Catholicism and Orthodox and Protestants and almost would actually agree on most of those things. And when a person steps outside those boundaries, you can't, in good faith, it seems to me, call yourself a Christian.
Well, the issue here, of course, with and James Talarico, just a more biography. He is a state representative in Texas, 36 years old, very winsome, very attractive in terms of the way he goes about his debating tactics. Very kind-hearted, seemingly, and seems to be the kind of guy you would love to have as your next-door neighbor. Make a phenomenal neighbor. But David French calls him here. But to finish that thought. By any measure, is I would say far left on issues of LGBTQ plus, on abortion, on the social issues that evangelicals would strongly disagree with him on. He seems to believe in a Jesus who's very different. Just a couple of quotes here from him, from his Twitter or X, formerly Twitter. He says, our trans community needs abortion care too. So when I use the word woman, it should not be understood as an exhaustive term, but rather as a lens through which to understand, examine, and to interrogate patriarchy. Okay, so there's one. Mm-hmm. Another, Texas Senate hopeful James Talarico says about being Christian and being pro-choice are absolutely consistent because Christianity is a feminist religion. Before explaining that Jesus, quote, Jesus was a radical feminist and probably pro-choice. And he says that, think about that, the only person to teach Jesus something was a woman, because she was the only person ever to beat Jesus in a debate.
So let's see. This woman taught Jesus something, therefore Jesus was a feminist. Put that in the form of a syllogism, and try to see if you get that kind of conclusion. There's a premise missing, that would be vital to that. So those are cognitive leaps in an argument, whether, and I would even question some of that, where Jesus would probably have been whatever. I'm just saying, well, where's your biblical authority for that? And that's what I'm saying with any of these people, if you go back and start examining, the issue is much more on biblical authority, and sometimes they will try to appeal to biblical authority. But, I think one of them was saying, Jesus never mentioned abortion.
Right.
Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, that's using what I call the red letter Bible. The only Bible that you use is that's written in red, that Jesus said it. Jesus authenticated, validated the entire Old Testament. Christianity sees the Bible as the Word of God, not simply the teachings of Jesus. So that's a problem. Most liberal theology, which is clearly what he is espousing here, most liberal theology just holds to the teachings of Jesus, and then they hold those selectively. And then they will make a statement such as, well, Jesus never mentioned abortion. Well, Jesus never mentioned racial prejudice. He never mentioned care for the environment. He never mentioned whether or not nations ought to go to war, but it's odd they don't mention any of those things. They're very selective. And so I think we see the same thing going on there. They're making just cognitive leaps in their arguments. And I noticed when they said Jesus would probably have been for abortion. I didn't hear any biblical quotes coming on that. So you hear jumping from, here's a person, he only learned from a woman, so therefore he's a feminist. That Jesus was a feminist. It's funny, they're just reading much more of their own experience, contemporary experience, back into the text rather than doing exegetical work on the text itself. So I think this is a clear case. We're just revisiting, and I know you talked about, you were going to mention it, you're just revisiting the classical liberal theology that came into prominence in America, from 1885 to, by 1930, it was pretty much complete. So you're seeing a replay of that.
Well, Talarico is what makes him attractive to David French is his attack on what French calls Christian nationalism, which he largely defines as the MAGA movement. He leaves it undefined. And here's what French wrote in his column last week at the New York Times. He said, Talarico is one of the few openly Christian politicians in the United States who acts like a Christian. He's a nice guy. And by acting like a Christian, he reveals a profound contrast with so many members of the MAGA Christian movement that's dominated American political life for 10 years. For too long, we've evaluated Christians in politics primarily through their policy positions. Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Do you support same-sex marriage? What's your position on immigration? Yet this is exactly backward, he says. So I think what he's saying here is that Talarico is a genuine Christian because he's a nice guy. And MAGA, because of all the sharp edges, and there are lots and lots of sharp edges, we would grant that, is unchristian. And now we're not here. I know your heart. I know you well. That we're not advocating for some kind of combative, abrasive Christianity. We don't believe that's Christ-like either. But which is why I asked the question: does being a conservative or being a part of MAGA, even if you identify yourself that way, does that make you a Christian? What I mean, it seems to me that French is leaving a lot of things undefined here, as if MAGA is synonymous with evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, so much of it is undefined. Nationalism, undefined. And that's where we have to be very careful, because any view that stands for anything like Christian morality in a modern day, same-sex marriage, homosexuality, any of these things we've talked about, if you hold any of those things, there are people that just tag you as being a Christian nationalist. Well, but a Christian nationalist is also these people who are almost ready to take up arms and cause a revolution. Well, if you categorize both of those as Christian nationalism, you actually can't even communicate on an issue, because the word means so much, it means nothing. And so, yes, they fail to distinguish. Sometimes I read those things, and these people are nothing but mean, and I'm saying, y'all are talking to different people than I am. I know people that hold these views, and none of them are mean. And by the way, I would take somebody that was opposed to abortion, same-sex marriage, killing babies. I would take them and not being a real nice person than I would a nice person who stood for all those things. Nice is not a worldview.
Great point.
What you're looking at is worldview, and where does this person stand? What's their final authority? Where do they stand on these issues? An atheist can be kind. A Muslim can be kind. A Christian can be kind. We ought to all be kind. There's no question about that. That's not the issue that's on the table. The issue is the issue of truth, and where is truth grounded, and where is truth found? And if you question people like our friend from Texas, you will find that he's not just disagreeing with Christianity on these issues. And when I say disagree with Christianity, I mean, you go back to the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, Tertullian. They all spoke very firmly against abortion. I mean, that has been a Christian position, but what you'll find out is this person is not holding aberrant views simply on marriage and homosexuality. You will find out that every major theological doctrine, you're going to find out he's holding an aberrant theology on. But most people, and this is what he's counting on, are not going to be thinking about that. They're going to see a nice guy, and we like to vote for nice guys, particularly if the other guys are presented as not nice. And if he can appeal to 5% of the voters that way that are swinging, he could pull that off, which is exactly what he's wanting to do.
Well, you look at Mayor Mamdani in New York, who recently elected mayor of New York, who is calls himself a Democratic socialist and is a Muslim and being very open about that. But he seems like a very winsome guy and a nice guy. He'd be likable. He might make a good neighbor. I mean, but he's not a Christian. And Talarico, yeah, he is winsome, and I get that. I do think we could use more. I think we would agree we need more winsomeness in our political discourse for sure. And the MAGA movement, I think it's wrong-headed, first of all, to make Christian nationalism, MAGA movement, to lump all those in with historic Orthodox Christianity, because I mean I do believe there are some of our leaders in Washington who seem to have strong theological beliefs that are biblical, grounded in Scripture. I mean, Marco Rubio, hearing him at Charlie Kirk's funeral, spoke and gave a beautiful rendition of the gospel. Pete Hegseth did the same thing, and others. But I don't think anyone in that movement is saying we're here to uphold historic Orthodox Christianity and American exceptionalism as one and the same.
Right.
And so that's where the question is. I think we can collapse in MAGA and politics, conservative politics, in on Orthodox Christianity. They're not the same thing. One may lead to the other. Right. One might be the outcome of the other. But they're not the same thing.
Yes, I've got a neighbor, very good neighbor, who is very, very strong MAGA, but he's not a Christian. So those two are not hand in hand. I think a lot of times, God's general revelation to us tells us a lot. A person doesn't have to be a Christian, for instance, to know, read the book of Amos, that you shouldn't take a instrument of iron and rip open pregnant women. I mean, you don't have to have a Bible to tell you something's wrong with that. That's right. and so just simply based on general revelation, there are people who would understand certain truths and stand for those that would not necessarily claim to be Christian.
That's right. And common grace.
Common grace, that's certainly, I think, fits. You have sort of right in with the general revelation, but they're exactly right. Just by common grace, they would know that. But again, they're sometimes, again, when they make these broad claims, these MAGA people being so mean, I keep saying, tell me exactly who you're talking about. And then also, they're sometimes associating mean or not nice with being firm.
Right.
When you hold to the rule of law, and you draw a line and say, that's what we're going to do, is that being mean? It's easy to depict somebody that way. So a lot of times, they talk about this person's so kind. Well, the other person's so kind too. They're just having to take some steps politically to correct some things that makes a person look very mean in doing it. So I think that's a problem. But I still go back to theologically, I mean, if a person wants to hold those political positions, that's okay. But to try to say they're Christian, they've got an argument that they're going to have to make that they haven't made. And if you go back all the way back to Gresham Machen, as we've talked about in his book, if you go all the way back to that, you can't make the argument at all, because it is not Christianity that they're actually espousing. It's a new religion that they are calling by that name.
That's right.
That's the thing that bothers me the most in it. Political disagreements, there can be there. But don't call something Christian or yourself a Christian if what you're believing is out of line with 2,000 years of Christian history.
Well, and one question I would like to ask David French, if he were here, is do you think that progressives on Capitol Hill, are they ever combative? Are they ever assertive? Do they ever speak in black and white terms in the way things ought to be, an oughtness about their beliefs? They certainly do. They impose them on. They in some ways it seems seek to impose their will on the populace, and things like DEI and all the different critical theories and all those things have driven much of the policies over the past 4 or 5 years, really the last 10 years, a couple of the administrations. So are they ever firm or seemingly mean-spirited? Well, I mean, just look at some of the hearings that go on day in and day out and on the Hill, and I think you'll see some firmness and combativeness in those people because they believe their ideas are right and they're arguing for them. We don't. I think we've lost any sense of history in terms of understanding that there's a polemical tradition within the Christian faith, and there's a polemical tradition within politics. We debate, and we debate strenuously. Go back to the Reformation. I mean, Luther at Worms, and look at Augustine, the Pelagians, and I mean, even Luther, some of the colorful language he used to describe his opponents and the popes and the woodcut drawings he did. I mean, he took the gloves off because truth was at stake. And so I don't know It seems like progressives want to kind of shut, or the progressive leanings want to shut down debate and say we just got to be nice when they're not very nice either about some of these things.
Yeah, I mean they're not equally applying their criticisms.
Right. Super critical.
They're carving out for themselves a little space where it doesn't apply to them. And I think the difference in this is where, there's going to a person's wanting to make a difference is I'm just trying to be firm and be real nice. And there's a lot of people that are going to latch on to that. Yeah, we need more niceness, and probably we do. But again, firm convictions, a lot of times it just a person comes across as being mean-spirited. And there's distortions of what people actually say. I mean, you get on the internet now and sure, this person says this person. Well, what did they say? What was the context of that? And then did they even say it at all? But yeah, I mean, they just leave out, other people. I mean, you look at some of the people that are shouting. The people that shouted at Trump's State of the Union, that stood up. It's like, are those people mean-spirited? Those, well, no, they were just standing up for what they believe. Well. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, the old saying goes.
Right. Thank you for listening to this podcast of the Baptist Courier and Courier Publishing. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to make sure you never miss an episode. Be sure to follow us on all social media platforms and send any question you want us to consider to courierconversations@gmail.com.